How much would immigration fall by if Brexit were to happen?
Well, the thing we'd be able to do is get the figures under control. And what I think is so scandalous about the figures today is that they show the failure of the government and indeed of several departments of state, the Home Office, Number 10, the Treasury, all said that we would be able to bring these numbers down to the tens of thousands. That has not proved possible. I'm in favour of immigration. I'm in favour of the benefits that it brings to our society. But I have to say that what is happening at the moment is being done completely without the consent of the British people. They voted at the general election to bring net immigration down to the tens of thousands. We've just heard that it is going up every year. It's now, I think, EU net immigration alone represents a city the size of Colchester. 77,000 EU immigrants have come here without any kind of job at all, despite the promises that we heard from the Prime Minister and others that they would get changes in the EU treaty, insisting that people would have to have a job before they came here. And for me, this is about democracy. It's about control and it's about consent. At the moment, what is happening is not with the consent of the British people, and the only way to achieve that is to take back control on June the 23rd and vote to leave.
It may be about principles, but it's also about numbers. I mean, you've gone through some of the numbers yourself. Is it your expectation that in the event of Brexit, you could be looking at net migration down to the tens of thousands? Is it possible to realise that hitherto, impossible to achieve aspiration in the event of Brexit?
I think it certainly is possible in the sense that you would take back control. At the moment, what is happening is that the government is pushing down very unfairly on, say, talented engineers from India or paramedics from Australia or whatever it happens to be, and has absolutely no control over huge numbers coming from the EU 28. And we would be able to decide our immigration policy on the needs of the British economy. Your report just now said, of course, we're always going to need immigration, and that's absolutely true. I, until recently, was mayor of a city that has thrived with large-scale immigration. But you see the pressures on public services, you see the waiting lists in hospitals, in GP surgeries, and, of course, in schools. People are feeling it, and I think what they resent is the lack of control.
Okay.
If you're going to promise the people that you can bring this down to the tens of thousands, then you need a means of doing so.
Okay.
The only means of doing so is to take back control on June the 23rd.
That point's contested by many people, and one of them is Max Hastings, who I think sometime would have been your editor at the Daily Telegraph when you were in Brussels. He writes in the Daily Mail this morning. He's a reluctant Remainer, I think he self-describes himself as being. And he says this, he says, we may regain power to keep out Polish plumbers and Romanian car washers, but a large proportion of the migrants we least want will continue to land at Heathrow and overstay visas, exploit relationships with people already domiciled here. And he concludes by saying, I'll hazard a wild guess that leaving would enable us to cut immigration by perhaps 15%. No more.
Well, I don't agree with... I mean, I think there's a very good point that Max Hastings makes there, which is that under the current EU system, it is indeed true that we cannot deport people who overstay their welcome. Indeed, we cannot deport people who are associated with terrorism or criminality because of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is now applicable across the whole of the EU area. And that is a real problem for us. There have been several recent cases where the Home Secretary has been unable to send overstayers or people we don't want in this country back because of the EU. And again, we would be able to do that if we left on June the 23rd, if we vote to leave on June the 23rd. I think that the crucial point here is that we've seen huge numbers now coming in, and I think the public feel, of course, we're a welcoming people. We understand the benefits of migration. What we don't understand is how politicians can continually tell us that they will restrict the numbers to the tens of thousands and then find that you've got every year a city the size of Newcastle arriving. The population of this country is, at the current rate of fire, the population of this country is going to go up to 70 or 80 million very, very shortly. And that is a change, a massive change in our lives that I don't think the people of this country have bargained for.
Okay,
it's time we took back control of immigration and go ahead with immigration, support our agriculture, support our businesses, but do it with the consent of the British people.
Well, look, immigration clearly is a key issue, and to some degree it's becoming the prominent issue within the camp that you speak for, or partly speak for. It's not the only issue, is it, that matters to people? We've talked a lot.
It's symbolic.
Let me just put the question. Another important subject clearly is security and defence, and some important people have come forward and talked about this on both sides of the argument. We had some senior former generals only this week making some important points. But let me put this quote to you from a speech of David Blunkett, former Home Secretary, and crucially, Home Secretary at the time of 9/11. And in part of his speech, he says this today. He says, the meetings we held at the Justice and Home Affairs Council at a Europe-wide level after September the 11th were illustrative of the importance of the ability to work quickly and effectively with all those who were then part of the Union. Is that not a perfect illustration of how actually the EU enhances security at moments of great peril and danger?
I think this is an illustration of the fundamental misunderstanding about what we're trying to leave. There's no one on my side of the argument is saying that we would detach ourselves from important international European meetings about defence, about security, about counterintelligence, about working on trying to stop mass illegal migration. But all those things that David Blunkett describes taking place in 2001 can be done at an intergovernmental level. They do not need to be policed by the Brussels Commission. They do not need to be adjudicated upon by the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. They do not need to be part of the rush to build a federal European superstate, a United States of Europe, which is effectively what they are trying to create. So all that cooperation could continue. And there are plenty of people, you'll have heard from Penny Mordaunt, who's a defence minister who believes our defence would certainly not be compromised. John Hayes, the security minister, is also on the Leave camp. Everybody understands the need to cooperate to protect our security. What you don't need to do is remain part of the federal system, which takes away power from the UK Parliament, power from the people, and in classic instances being our inability to control immigration.
Can we talk a little bit about the economy? The IFS report yesterday, which talked about short-term recession. We had a Treasury forecast, which I'm sure you would have criticised at the start of the week as well. Tactically, there is a sense, is there not, that's coming through from some people who feel that the shrewdest thing to have done from your perspective would have been to say, look, yes, there's going to be a short-term hit. There may be some recession. The economy may go backwards for a period of months, possibly even years. But that ultimately is a price worth paying. Rather than actually what's been going on, which is people saying on your side, look, we just don't know. Would it not have been shrewder to say, yes, there'll be a hit, but it's a price worth paying?
Well, actually, I think the best authority on this was the Prime Minister, who decided to hold this referendum a while back and said that he thought there would be an awful lot of scaremongering, but actually Britain could prosper perfectly well and strike trade deals perfectly well outside the European Union. And that is, I think, the fact of the matter. We're hearing an awful lot of stuff at the moment from the Remain side that I think is starting to lose touch with credibility, any touch with credibility whatsoever. They are, going on and on about the downsides to such an extent that I fear they are starting to talk the UK down. We are a great country, we're a great economy, we are prospering and flourishing in all sorts of areas which have absolutely nothing to do, such as the tech sector, which have absolutely nothing to do with our membership of the EU. If you look at what has happened with our trade with the EU over the last, other EU partners over the last 20 years, actually other countries outside the EU have done far better than us in exporting both goods and services to the EU countries, whilst not being fettered and encumbered with that vast body of undemocratically imposed EU
and you would say that vast body is exemplified no better than in the personage of Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, who, if you can just, I know you've got to dash off, but if you just indulge me for another minute or so, this is what he's had to say recently, inviting you to Brussels on an educational visit. Have a listen.
I'm reading in British papers that Boris Johnson spent part of his life in Brussels. It's time for him to come back to Brussels in order to check in Brussels if everything is telling the British people is in line with reality. I don't think so.
Well, I'm afraid what I'm saying to the British people is in line with reality. And if we vote to remain, which I sincerely hope that we don't, on June the 23rd, then they will go on with measures to take us further into a federal European superstate. The whole exercise in Brussels is now aimed at propping up the euro. That is the entire mission of the European Union. They will try to create a fiscal union, a political union. Germany, who is effectively the paymaster of this whole enterprise, will want to insist that there is an economic governance of Europe that, in my view, will eventually become profoundly, it's already profoundly anti-democratic, but it will tend towards the creation of a United States of Europe, into which I'm afraid Britain will inevitably be sucked by the usage of single market mechanisms. And I'm afraid we have not been able to get out from under the obligation of paying for this whole exercise.
Boris Johnson,
if you saw what happened with the Greek bailout, we were hooked on that too.
OK, got to leave it there. Boris Johnson, thanks for your
time.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.